Hello everyone, I'm Brian. Today I'm going to be reacting to the Four Noble Truths, Swami Sarvapriyananda. So, this is for Buddhists. Now, well, I don't know what that statue is. I assume it was Buddha, but I am not sure now, actually. Literally, now I wasn't sure. Because I've seen statues of Buddha, at least the fat ones, which is, I don't know what they mean, actually, honestly. I've always thought that being Buddha, but now I heard there's the skinny Buddha, which is the real Buddha, which is the wise one. And then I think the fat one is supposed to be like the God Buddha, like a deity. I'm not sure, honestly. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started with this. Again, Buddhism was my first introduction to Eastern philosophy a long time ago in college.
Om Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityurma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness unto light, lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Today, I would like to speak about the Buddha, but instead of concentrating on the life story of Buddha, we would like to talk about his central teachings today. Bhagavan Buddha, there is this nice story about him after he attained enlightenment, Bodhi. This story is narrated by Huston Smith at the beginning of his chapter on Buddhism in his book, The Religions of the World. He says that attaining enlightenment, the Buddha decided to teach humanity, and he is walking, and then somebody sees him, a young shepherd boy, and that boy calls out to him, "What are you?" And Huston Smith remarks that many people have been asked, "Who are you?" Many people ask, "Who are you?" But very few people in history have been asked, "What are you?" So amazing was the appearance, the expression, the shining countenance of the Buddha, that this little boy burst out asking, "What are you? Are you a god?" The Buddha said, "No." "Are you an angel?" I'm sure in the Indian context it would have meant one of the dwellers of the higher worlds. "Are you an angel?" He says, "No." "Are you a human being?" And the Buddha says, "No." "What are you?" And he says, "I am the awakened Buddha." Meaning thereby that the rest of us are either sleeping or dreaming or sleepwalking. There is something, a higher life into which we awaken, and that is the message of the Buddha. The Buddha walked on to find his first group of disciples, who were actually a group of 5 ascetics with whom the Buddha had practiced severe austerities. And to them, he gave his first teaching, what is called the Dhamma Chakra Pravartana Sutra, the teaching on the turning of the wheel of Dharma. Now, we know the story of the Buddha, that how in his youth he had been accustomed to extraordinary luxury, how he gave all of that up, and then for years together practiced intense austerity, especially with this group of 5 hermits. He went to the extent of nearly starving himself to death in search of enlightenment. So the first thing that he taught them, and when he first came to them, these 5 were not willing to learn from him because they thought he has abandoned the way of austerity. Look at this fellow, he was with us, now he abandoned us, and he's probably gone back to his luxury or whatever. But then they saw that remarkable expression and the peace on his face, and they were amazed, and they listened to him. And the Buddha first, of course, told them the famous teaching of the middle path, that on the spiritual path, not luxury, neither too much austerity, neither is helpful to spirituality. The middle path. And then the Buddha gave his central teaching, the so-called Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths which he transmitted to this first group of disciples, upon which it is said, hearing which they all became enlightened. These Four Noble Truths are basically the sum and substance of the entire teaching of Buddhism. They are the foundation, so to say. And so today in this session I thought we will take a closer look at the Four Noble Truths. I mean, we all know the Four Noble Truths. When we were at school, I remember we had this chapter on Buddhism in our social sciences, and the Four Noble Truths, we had to memorize them, and we've got, I think, 1 or 2 marks when you write down the Four Noble Truths or something like that in your examination. And so we all know that. The first noble truth is that there is suffering, dukkha. The second noble truth is that there is a cause of suffering, and that is desire, trishna. And the third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering, called nirvana, release or cessation. And then the fourth noble truth is that there is a way to go beyond suffering. There is a method to it that is called marga, the way, the well-known Ashtanga marga, the eightfold way. So this is the Four Noble Truths. We all know, we have heard about it, we have read about it. But let's take a closer look today at this wonderful teaching. Very simple, very direct, very logical. 2,500 years ago, and it appeals to our hearts even today. It inspires us. It is practical. It is something that is a blessing to each of us in our daily lives when we hear about it, think about it, and try to implement a little bit of it also in our lives. The first noble truth. So this is all based on this very important sutra. The sutra literature in Buddhism is the teachings of the Buddha himself. They are called the sutras. The Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra. And there, the first noble truth is the truth that there is suffering, dukkha. Dukkha is the word in Sanskrit and in Pali also. It means suffering. We know the story how the Buddha, when he was the prince Siddhartha, Gautama Siddhartha, his father had kept him secluded away from all kinds of suffering because it had been prophesied that this boy is going to either become a great emperor or become a great monk and teacher. And of course his father, who was a king, wanted his son to be a king and an emperor and not to be a monk. And so he kept the prince secluded away from all kinds of suffering, kept him in great luxury so that his mind would not go to the sufferings of the world. But who can stop the workings of fate? And one day the prince was on his chariot with his charioteer going out into the city, and then he saw the sights, the 4 sights that he saw. First, he saw he saw an old person, tottering with old age, walking with the help of a stick. The next, he saw a sick person.
Before he continues on, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask this question. So his father kept him secluded, but how did he go out with the charioteer? You know, how did he go out into the public? Clearly he snuck out. I'm assuming he snuck out in this story because his father would deny him to go to the city because like you said earlier, he wanted his child to be secluded, and that's what I was told also in my world religions class. He was kept with all the best ladies, best food, best whatever, best entertainment, and never had any kind of suffering.
Lying helplessly. And third, he saw a dead person being carried to the cremation ground. So old age, disease, death, and in each case he asked the charioteer that what has happened to this person? Will it happen to my father and my wife and child and to me? And the charioteer said, yes, this is old age. It happens to everybody, even to you, O prince. This is disease. It happens to everybody, even to you, O prince. This is death. It is inevitable. All will die, including you, O prince. And as he was thinking thus, he sees the 4th sight, which is a monk who has set out in search of enlightenment. And so this put in the mind of the prince the idea that I must seek a solution to this inevitable suffering, which is for everybody. It's there in life. I was thinking that these sights which he saw, old age, disease, and death, in our modern world, how carefully we avoid these sights. Right now, we are under the grip of this pandemic, the COVID-19 virus all over the world, but especially so here in New York City. I was speaking with a doctor here, and we were discussing this, that how the doctors and the medical care professionals in the emergency rooms in the hospital, they are watching this life and death battle every day. And many of them are traumatized by what they are seeing, this terrible struggle to save people, most of whom are dying, thousands and thousands of deaths, hundreds of thousands of infections and patients. And yet, most of us, we do not see it because of the system, that it is all taken away from, ambulance comes and takes away the patient into the hospital. If they survive, they come back. If they don't, they die there. But we don't see the actual desperate battles. Everything is on TV these days, even war. But somehow, because it's probably seen as not good form, it's not polite to show the sufferings of people, you don't actually see the suffering of the patients in the emergency rooms, in the ICUs directly. And of course, there are privacy laws and all, everything.
Yeah, I worked in a hospital, so I did get to see all that. I remember my first day in the hospital. I went to the morgue, and I was shown the morgue because I'm going to eventually start taking people there. And so the first day I was shown there to the morgue, and there was a guy doing it. I believe, I don't know if it's an autopsy or not, but they had the dude wide open, wherever it was, wide open. He's pulling out stuff, and then he goes, "Hey." And I'm like, "Hey, let's." It looked fake. It really looked fake. It didn't look like it was real at all. It was really weird. I've taken many people to the morgue. I've taken as young as a baby up to old age to the morgue. I've never was not there for the grievances of the families though. So I was a patient transportation. So I transport patients from and to wherever they need to go, and if they're dead, I need to take them to the morgue. So I was never there necessarily for the interactions of people, generally speaking, especially those who have died. But yeah, I was not I don't know. I was not necessarily affected by it. It's weird. I understand it was part of my job. I understand that's just life. You have to understand we're eventually all gonna die anyway. So that is something that you have to come to accept, because it's going to happen.
So the result of it is that we are insulated from the suffering which is going on right now. That makes for a pleasant life for the rest of us, more or less pleasant life. But the downside is that just like that, the prince who was insulated from suffering, we are also insulated from suffering by the system we have today. Why just New York? It's the same system all over the world today. We don't get to see old age and disease and death directly, day after day. I was thinking that just about 100 years ago, when the hospital system was not so widespread, so the disease would be in our houses. The patient would be a member of our family whom, whether you like it or not, whether you enjoy it or not, you have to take care of this person who is sick in your house. The assisted living facilities into which we send our old people, our elderly members of the family, there are very good reasons that maybe the care is better and everything, but the fact is that then that suffering is no longer before our eyes. It is shunted out. We don't have to confront suffering which is natural, which is there, but somehow we have hidden it from our eyes. Similarly,
I'm sorry, I want to pause it there. Actually, wow, that's right. I've never kind of seen it that way, although I wanted to get to the fact that just in life in general, a lot of people obviously don't want to suffer, don't want to see hardship. But the side effect of not seeing hardship, or in a sense the truth, is that people end up becoming spoiled because they don't know what hardship is. They don't know reality, honestly, actually. And for some odd reason, I don't know why I was drawn to that. It's the sheer fact that, what he's saying about how we're shunning ourselves from reality, and because of this, we have this facade, this fake reality that we're invincible or whatever, and that it's only goodness out in the world, and we have this illusion that that is the fact, when in reality it's not. I'm not saying the world is all bad or all good, but we have to come to understanding that there are bad and good in the world, and people who are shunned from this, when they face it for the first time, they're going to struggle because they've not seen this before. They've not been introduced slowly into these things. But to say that we're hiding, yeah, whenever you put your family into this elderly care centers, you're not seeing the suffering. It's kind of like when you go there, they're presented like nicely and whatnot. You're not seeing the everyday occurrence that they're going through, whether they're in pain or whatever. It's like you release your responsibilities to someone else. Again, quick easy fixes. It's like, oh, I don't want to take care of my parents. Just pay the money to let someone else do it.
Poverty. We don't want to look at poverty and homelessness. We don't want to look at disease. We don't want to look at old age. The downside is this insight which the prince got, that there is pervasive suffering and we must find a way out of it. This insight we don't get. As a result, we are shocked when the suffering spills out and we can no longer avoid it, like a pandemic. It is everywhere now. And we have to confront it. It's there in everybody's lives now. Somebody said to me a couple of months ago, when it was just starting, Swami, many people are going to ask, why is this happening? Why is there so much suffering? Why are people, why is the whole world in the grip of this suffering? And I was thinking, if you asked the Buddha, he would have probably said, why are you surprised? This is the very nature of life. You have insulated yourself from it. You live in a bubble and you don't see it. But it's always there. It has always been there. Individually, people struggled with disease, old age, death, and the rest of the world happily went on ignoring it. But now, when it spills over, once in a while it will. And then nobody can avoid it. And then we are shocked, as if something strange is happening.
Wow, actually, yes. I know disease and everything exists, and I knew eventually that. Well, I never honestly thought it would get into a pandemic style. I knew that eventually there would be viruses, especially like the what was that? God, I can't remember what virus that was though. It originated, I believe, in Africa, and God, I wish I could remember, but I think it had like a 50% mortality rate. It was widespread in Africa. There was a mission to go out there and help them out, and then some people have brought it over to the United States. Man, I wish I could remember what the disease was. It's always have occurred, but no one ever really thought about it until it finally affected them here in the States. It has a very high mutation rate, high kill rate. I think it's 50%. And for some odd reason, I can't think about it. But and another example that I thought of whenever I said that was the sheer fact that there's a lot of people out there who, especially rich people, who who don't see the suffering of the poor, and they don't think it's occurring because they're rich people tend to be around rich people, and when all they see is this luxurious life and they don't see the suffering, they don't know the suffering of the poor people, and they don't think the suffering is real. Very much so. It's not until they see it happen to them then actions happen. This also applies to like politics and stuff. Very much with the pandemic as well, where our governor didn't really take it seriously until one of their family members got affected by it, and then all of a sudden things started changing. It's kind of funny how it's like, oh no, everything's going to be fine. Then all of a sudden they got it, or their family member got it, someone they cared got it. Then all of a sudden everything changes. That has happened many times, even in 2020. Not the pandemic, but the the riots and stuff. There were everything was fine and dandy, and all of a sudden everything changed.
From a Buddhist perspective, suffering is universal and pervasive. Swami Tapasyanandaji, who was the vice president of our order, I never met him, but I've heard from other senior monks that he would say, Buddhism is a serious religion, by which he meant to begin in Buddhism, the first thing one must grasp is all is suffering. Not that there is happiness and suffering. No, all is suffering. Suffering is suffering, happiness is also suffering.
Whoa.
So what is this universal truth of suffering which the Buddha taught? The first thing which we have to grasp in the beginning of our spiritual life.
Even happiness is suffering. Wow.
Let's take a closer look at it.
That's an interesting statement.
The Buddhists speak of these four noble truths. The Buddha spoke of them in the first sutra, Dharmachakra Pravartana Sutra. He spoke of it, each of them in three phases, so to say. The first phase of the truth of suffering, he describes suffering, that there is this truth of suffering. The second phase is that we must understand what is suffering in our lives, notice it, what are the different kinds of suffering, how it operates in our lives and affects us. That's the second phase. The third phase is that when it becomes internalized, when the practitioner or the spiritual seeker, now whenever he or she comes in contact with samsara, we automatically know, we are not deceived, we know the nature of samsara is suffering. Whether evidently so or implicitly so, there is suffering everywhere. So these are the three phases. First, it is described, the truth of suffering. Second, we understand kinds of suffering in our lives. And third, we internalize it, that we know the life we are leading is pervaded by suffering. So what are the kinds of suffering? The Buddhists speak of three kinds of suffering. There is the suffering of suffering. The first kind. The suffering of suffering is nothing other than the sorrow and the misery that we all face. The physical pain and disease and even animals and down to insects and plants, all living beings face suffering. Physical pain, and in the higher creatures like us, there's also mental pain. There is anxiety and tension and fear. So physical and mental suffering, this is called suffering of suffering. And at this level, there are mundane cures. So illness is there, and there's a cure. There is medicine. We don't have a vaccine yet for COVID-19, but very soon, certainly we will have it. All our resources, we will certainly within next 1 or 2 years, we will get this vaccine. So there is a cure. Medicine cures your illness. If you are bored, there are many ways of entertainment. TV is there and so on. For various kinds of mundane suffering, there are mundane solutions, but none of them are permanent.
Thank you. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, it's really weird to say that all this suffering, there's, again, quick fixes. That's the problem. I think that is generally the problem. It's the people that wants the quick fixes because they don't want to suffer. They don't want to go through it. They don't want to push through it. They just want it to end whatever way it takes without them having to proceed through it. In my opinion, that kind of makes them weak in that sense, because if they can't push through it on their own, they're going to continually need whatever it is that makes them end suffering. That's why there are people out there who do drugs, because they can't take the suffering, the pain of whatever it is. People smoke when they get anxious, and that's the reason why a lot of people smoke, because when they're anxious, they smoke to calm their nerves, because they can't calm their own nerves, so they're reliant on drugs. And I'm glad it said they're not permanent, because again, people who get anxious, the smokers basically, they smoke to calm down their nerves, and then all of a sudden they get anxious again, they smoke again. They're dependent on drugs to calm themselves down, to fix whatever problem they have, instead of pushing through it on their own. The more and more you tackle these problems on your own, by sheer, I won't say sheer will, but by understanding the problem, which is Wow, I didn't realize the method that I used was, in a sense, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's mostly a lot of Western, Eastern philosophies, but it's really cool that I've kind of discovered it on my own in some sense. But you have to, the more that you suffer and the more that you understand and solve your suffering, the better you become at not suffering as much.
They may cure one type of suffering in one part of our lives, but the others are there. And the same suffering may come back again. Hunger, eat, it is satisfied. But it comes back again later in the day. So similarly, mundane cures are there, but nothing is permanent. Deeper than this is what the second type, which Buddhists call the suffering of change. Now, this is a deeper level. The same suffering. Now what the Buddhists say that you take a deeper look at it, at three levels. The first level, it is just pain, physical, mental. This deeper level, it is the suffering of change. What it means is, we reach out into the world for pleasure, for satisfaction, in objects, in people, in relationships, in activities. And we expect, they look very attractive to us. And we expect it will give us happiness. And initially it does also, for a short while. But then something happens. Something happens. That thing changes, which was beautiful and handsome at one time, is no longer that. That which was shiny and new, latest gadget, now there is a better phone on the market, and the earlier phone which I had purchased, which was so attractive, now it seems outdated to me. So there is what we found to be attractive, promising pleasure and happiness, very soon changes. And not only do these objects of pleasure, they change, but our mind also changes. So we expect to get happiness from these things, and after some time, our expectations change. But we don't learn. The moment certain things stop providing us with happiness, we do not like it anymore. Maybe we want to get rid of it. Instead of learning that, oh, this thing, it seemed to promise so much happiness, it did not give as much as it seemed to promise. Not only that, now it does not seem to be a source of happiness anymore, whether it's a person or a place or a food or an activity or a job or a gadget or my own body or youth or health. All of these things disappoint. But we don't learn the lesson. We immediately move on to another thing. That thing will give me happiness, and we start chasing that thing. Why does this happen? This happens because change is pervasive. Things change. This change is the source of unhappiness.
That's interesting.
Why do things change? This is an insight in Buddhism that all things are interdependent. Nothing exists by itself. The language they use, nothing exists from its own side. Everything is other powered, so to say. It is dependent on other things. Every entity is made of components and depends on those components. And if it is under the power of other things, every entity is under the power of other things for its own birth, for its existence, and for its decay and death. So continuously, if you depend on something else, you are subject to change. As those underlying factors change, the entity also will start changing. By entity, I mean a body, it could be your mind, it could be your possessions, everything in this universe, relationships, our own thoughts, all of these are dependent on other things.
That was the last Buddhism video that I watched. It was about independence. Was it nothingness? I'm sorry, I can't remember the title, but it was just literally the last Buddha video that I watched. Basically, I didn't quite understand what they were trying to say, but if I remember correctly, from what I understood was everything was dependent on everything, and if something is independent, it's nothingness. Which I'm like, what do you mean? I don't quite understand. Swami explained it quite well. That again, it's the same thing, but just somehow I don't know why that quite fit in my mind. How everything is dependent of each other, and when one thing changes, whatever's dependent on it, one thing also will change. But I wanted to go back a little bit before, where how how we see like a brand new cell phone. It's like, oh, that's really nice, I want it. All of a sudden, a new cell phone comes like, oh man, that looks so much better. This one looks like an old piece of crap. It's only 3 days old and it's already outdated. And that's why you see a lot of rich people just buying a whole bunch of stuff, and it's because these things, they're looking externally for happiness, and externally for happiness is these things, these like this pen used to make me happy, then it's about to run out of ink, so it's gonna make me unhappy. But you get the point. Like, they look externally for happiness because they can't find happiness within themselves, so they have to find these other things to buy and buy and buy, and all of a sudden they got used to it, or it's old or whatever, and they're no longer happy by it and have to keep buying new things. This is something man, I forgot what I was going to say. It's something to do with Sadhguru. Sadhguru was talking about how we have to look with. I am not quoting him verbatim, but it's along the lines of, you have to find happiness within yourself. You have to be just happy with who you are in your life. If you continue to look externally for your happiness, which is what they're saying here, is that your happiness becomes dependent on objects of external things, and whenever those external things change, your happiness change along with that, whether it be greater or less, but more than likely less, because you're not going to be happy with an object for very long, because things change, which is going to Buddhism. Things are, well, everything changes in all teachings, but it's kind of crazy how a lot of these things are fitting together so well. And how a lot of teachings are saying, look within for happiness, be happy with yourself, be bliss with yourself, and don't depend on other things for happiness. Wow.
Being interdependent, this is subject to continuous change. Now, it is not really that change itself is the source of unhappiness. Now, usually it is in our unenlightened state, but one must see that those who are enlightened, the Buddha, for example, or the great Buddhist masters who followed the Buddha, they also, after enlightenment, they lived in the same world, they lived in the same body, the changing world and the changing body, and possibly the changing mind, and yet they claimed that they have gone beyond suffering. So change is not tantamount to suffering. It is our unenlightened state in which we grasp at changing objects, thinking that they are going to be unchanging sources of joy for us. If you put it that way, it sounds so illogical and crude, but that's how we behave. It's our unenlightened approach to change, our lack of knowledge of reality, which is the cause of suffering. So this is the suffering of change. Suffering of change. And this leads to a deeper understanding of change, the third level of understanding of sorrow or suffering. First level, suffering of suffering. Second, deeper level, suffering of change. Third level, what the Buddhists call pervasive suffering. Pervasive suffering is this unenlightened state in which we have this body-mind, and we grasp this body-mind as ourselves. I am this body-mind. By the way, I'm using the terms body-mind, but the terms you will actually find in the Buddhist books, they're slightly different. The technical term would be the panchaskandha, the 5 aggregates. So instead of saying body-mind, the Buddhist terminology is 5 aggregates. In the 5 aggregates, first is the rupa skandha, which is the body, the physical body. And then the next 4 are all mental. There is the Vedana, which is sensation, all the sensations that we are having all the time, and which can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Then there is Sangya, the first conceptions that we label these sensations. Book, tree, man, nice. All of these things are the Sangya skandha. And then comes the Samskara skandha. All the storehouse of our past karma, our impressions, each individualized, what we call our personality, our tendencies, our memories, our desires, the samskara. Each of us has this baggage. And then the Vijnana skandha. Vijnana skandha is the consciousness, the awareness itself. So the last 4, first one is the body, and the last 4 is what we call the mind. And awareness, for the clarification of Vedanta students, is we are not talking about pure consciousness or Brahman or Atman, nothing like that. We're talking about this empirical mental awareness which we all have. Just now we are all aware, that much. So these are the 5 skandhas, pancha skandha. This is what I am, instead of saying 5 skandhas every time, I am just saying body-mind. It refers to the same thing. Our unenlightened grasping of the body-mind as ourselves. This is the basis of what the Buddhists call pervasive suffering. As long as we think of ourselves as a self in this body and mind, we are subject to endless suffering. And the takeaway from this pervasive suffering is, note that even for the Buddha, body-mind continued. After enlightenment also the Buddha had the body, and they had, presumably had a mind, an enlightened mind. So body-mind again itself is not the source of suffering. In our present condition as unenlightened beings, body-mind is the source of suffering, and as long as we have that, that is pervasive suffering. In this condition, whatever happens is infected by suffering. But note that body-mind themselves are not suffering. After enlightenment, the same body-mind will not be a problem for the enlightened being. So it's actually ignorance which is the cause of suffering. But in our present state, what the Buddhists say is that we have to admit that we are unenlightened. In an unenlightened state, this body-mind itself is the source of suffering. And since we are always with the body and mind, everything in our life is infected by suffering. This is called pervasive suffering.
Yeah, when I first understood it seems like there's no escape from suffering because the body and mind is part of the suffering, but yet somehow it's not the cause of it. So basically, even when you die, because your body and mind will continue on to another body-mind or another body, but I'm assuming the mind will transfer into that body, which at that point you're again suffering. Even enlightened, I would assume you would be suffering, but somehow I'm not sure how does the enlightenment removes you from your mind, because the mind is everything that you are minus the body, and there's nothing else outside of that. That's literally you in a sense, all there with the suffering. But enlightenment can remove you from that. So is it then that once you're enlightened, that your mind is no longer suffering? That's so far how I'm understanding it. But it's weird to say that even the mind and body itself is suffering, even in the next body, or as your mind goes to the next body. It's called pervasive suffering.
So 3 levels. Not 3 kinds, but 3 levels of understanding of suffering in our life. The day-to-day suffering, which is called suffering of suffering. The fact that there is change, which is at the root of why we are suffering. And even deeper, this ignorant clinging to body-mind and everything that comes from it. So this is suffering.
Clinging to body and mind, but in Buddhism, that is all there is. There is no Turiya, Brahman, Atman, which in Advaita Vedanta would be your true self, the reality, the mind and body in Advaita. As far as my understanding, Advaita Vedanta is this Maya, this falsehood, which is the suffering. And to be rid of that suffering, you must understand that you are Brahman, enlightened. But with Buddhism, there is no there's no Atman Brahman, so therefore the samskara, I believe, which is your personality, the mind, is who you are. At least as far as I understand. I've, again, maybe 6 videos into Buddhism, but how does suffering, I guess that's where I understand, but yet I don't know what the pieces in my mind's not sticking quite right. It's not, the puzzles aren't connecting quite right.
Pervasive suffering. Another way of looking at the same thing is what is called 8 types of suffering. By the way, by now you must have realized
there's a lot of
that
suffering.
the Buddhists are very big on 4 sites and 3 phases and 4 types of suffering and 8 types of suffering. So the Buddhism is very analytic. It looks at the human situation and analyzes it into its factors. Very logical, very analytic. So you'll keep coming across 3 types of this and 4 types of that.
Let me drink suffering.
8 types of suffering. Same suffering, analyzed
suffering.
in another way. So this 8 types of suffering comes from a great Tibetan master, Tsongkhapa. He is central to Tibetan Buddhism. He lived about 500 years ago. He is a good way of understanding it would be what Adi Shankaracharya is to Vedanta in Hinduism, Tsongkhapa is to Tibetan Buddhism. So that's the importance of Tsongkhapa. In fact, one of the 4 main traditions of Tibetan Buddhist monasticism, the Gelugpa, to which the Dalai Lama belongs, that was founded by Tsongkhapa. And the central commentarial texts of Tibetan Buddhism, many of them are written by Tsongkhapa. Why I'm going on and on about him is because I was introduced to his work last year in a course on Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka Buddhism at Harvard. So it was a privilege to study the works of Tsongkhapa. It is amazing, the original teachings of the Buddha 2,500 years ago, and then about 500 years later, the commentaries, the Karikas written by Nagarjuna. A few hundred years after that, the great philosopher Chandrakirti, commenting on the texts of Nagarjuna. And then nearly 800 years, 900 years after that comes Tsongkhapa in Tibet. And about 500-600 years after that, we are studying it in 21st century, there at Harvard University. So it's an amazing journey of 2,500 years. The same teachings. So what does Tsongkhapa say? 8 types of suffering. No need to feel bewildered. It's the same thing, but in a different way of looking at it. So he says the first one is the suffering of birth. Second one is suffering of old age. Third one is suffering of disease. Fourth one is suffering of death. Fifth one is the suffering of coming into contact with what is unpleasant. Sixth is the suffering of the severance of contact, losing contact with what is pleasant. The 7th is the suffering of my desires not being fulfilled. And the 8th is the suffering of the ignorance of being attached to body-mind. So 8 types. But it's very interesting. It's a very sophisticated way of looking at suffering. Look at the first 4. These are the sights that the Buddha saw, including old age, disease, and death. And he includes birth. So birth is suffering. And it's traumatic. We forget. Luckily, we forget. But being born is a very traumatic process. Psychologists say that the babies have this trauma while being born, and it has an effect on our life. Thank God we don't consciously remember that. Then there is suffering of old age.
Real quick, the order in which he said it, is that the real order? I believe it was birth, old age, something else, and death. I'm like, I thought birth, middle age, old age, and death, like in the order of life. But I think there's something in the middle of, like, old age and death weren't quite in the right order. I wonder if that's intentional.
Bill Conrad, who's here, he is 95 years old, and he was telling me a few days back, he was quoting Betty Davis, and he said, Betty Davis said that suffering is not for, old age is not for sissies. Old age is not for sissies. Old age is suffering. Disease is suffering, as we know all today, all over the world. We're all scared of the pandemic. And then death is suffering. It's interesting that the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna, he says to Arjuna in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha doshanudarshanam etad jnanamiti proktam. He says, this is knowledge, to inquire into the sufferings of birth, death, old age, disease. Janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha doshanudarshanam. Birth is suffering, death is suffering, old age is suffering, disease is suffering, and When you understand that these are suffering, this is the basis, the foundations for jnana, for enlightenment. Exactly the same teaching which you find there. So these are the first four. Now these first four can be actually telescoped into two. Contact with what is unpleasant and loss of contact with what is pleasant. Pain and disease and the feebleness of old age and slowing down of mental faculties, this is contact with what is unpleasant. And loss of contact with what is pleasant. My youth, my energy, my enthusiasm, my possessions and money and job, all of that. So if you lose contact, that is suffering. So all the sufferings of the world are now telescoped into, collapsed into two. And these two also can be further, all kinds of suffering, these two also can be further compressed into one, which is my desires not being satisfied. That's the seventh type which Tsongkhapa speaks of. Everywhere we have suffering, one thing you must know for sure, something in my mind, some expectation is not fulfilled or some hope is dashed. My desire is not fulfilled. It may be justified. I may be right to expect it, but it is not fulfilled. I had something in mind, it is not fulfilled, hence I am unhappy. Simple fact, but very profound fact. You see, remember the second noble truth which is going to come is desire is the cause of suffering. So here he says, it is a desire which is not fulfilled which leads to suffering. All suffering at the back of the mind is something which was, some kind of expectation, desire which was not met, frustrated. Frustration of my desire is suffering. And then the eighth one is basically at the root of every kind of suffering. Even this seventh one, they are all based on the last eighth one. The eighth one is clinging to body, mind as self. This ignorance-based clinging to, he will say five aggregates, but remember, 5 aggregates are body, mind. So this is Tsongkhapa's analysis of suffering, 8 types of suffering. There is one more point to be made about suffering. So Buddhists, as you can see, somebody said they are really experts at raining on our parade. They're big on suffering. There is one more point.
One more point with like 16 branches of suffering.
Each of the 4 noble truths has 4 characteristics. I'll speak only about the 4 characteristics of the first noble truth, that is the truth of suffering. 4 characteristics are anityam, impermanence, dukkham, suffering itself, shunyam, emptiness, anatma, selflessness. What does it mean? Very briefly, anityam, as we saw, things change. On the surface of it, it seems that things change. Yes, we know that. Things are born, they exist for some time, then they die. That's the first level. But when you look deeply at it, it is not only that things born and they exist, even when they seem to exist in a stable way, moment to moment everything is changing. Not only anityam, kshanikam. Anityam means impermanent, kshanikam means momentary. Moment to moment things are changing. That moment to moment these things are changing, this is also not so difficult. Modern physics will tell us that yes, moment to moment things are changing. If you look even further, and more deeply, that the Buddhist will say that not only moment to moment it is changing, from the very beginning and throughout, the causes of destruction of everything are already there. What it means is, normally we think of a thing being born, and then it lives and it grows and develops, and then it declines and dies. But the Buddhist way of looking at it is, being born is the start of the process of dying. Birth itself is the beginning of dying. Creation itself is the beginning of destruction. The processes which lead to the death of the body, processes which lead to the disintegration of any entity, they are already at work when the thing is born or produced. And it is true. So this is the deep understanding of anityam. Everything is fundamentally impermanent.
And I want to say something real quick to that about the creation. As soon as something's created, it is basically dying. And here's a little extra, and let me know what you think about this. Yes, when we're born, we are dying, but we are constantly fighting to survive. Our cells are dying as soon as it's created, but our cells recreate new cells and replace the old and create new and the old goes away and die and new ones are replacing it. So we're constantly battling destruction until we no longer can fight it, and then we die. That's basically life. I mean, technically, yeah, everything that's alive is fighting to survive.
Irredeemably so. It cannot be remedied. And this leads to the next one, which is dukkham. That being impermanent and clinging to these impermanent things as if we want to live in this body and be young forever and have these objects which will give us happiness, expect people to behave nicely with us forever, all the time. No, this is not justified, and yet we do that, and this is dukkham, the second factor of the first noble truth. This leads to the third factor, shunyam. Emptiness has many aspects, but one aspect of emptiness is that when we expect that there is a self, I am not the body and mind, I am a separate self in charge of the body and mind, this is my body and my mind, the Buddhist says there is no such self. This is directly in opposition to the dualistic Hindu schools. The Nyaya or the Vaisheshika, which said apart from body and mind there is one Atma. The Buddhist says apart from body and mind, but that Atma, what is there? Empty, shunyam. There is no such thing. Okay. Because we think that leads to suffering. And then the fourth one, selflessness. The first one is anityam, impermanence. Second one is dukkham, suffering. Third one is shunyam, emptiness. The fourth one is selflessness or anatma. The shunyata talks about that apart from the five aggregates or body and mind, there is no self. And the anatma, selflessness, talks about that in these five aggregates, in the body mind, there is no self. If you look at the body mind, the physical body, the organs, the mind, thoughts, feelings, ego, which one of them is the self? These two might seem to be, difference seem to be subtle. One is the emptiness of self, and the other one is selflessness. There is no self apart from the body and mind, and there is no self in the body and mind also. So these are two subtle aspects. One thing, those who are trained in Advaita Vedanta will immediately notice, the Advaitic concept of Atman is neither of them. When you say the Atman, Satchidananda, is it an entity apart from body and mind? Remember the example of gold and the ornaments. Is gold an entity apart from the golden necklace? Is there something called gold and something called a necklace? You immediately say, no. Right there. And in the necklace, the name necklace or the form necklace, is any one of them gold? No. Gold is the reality of the necklace, you might say. Similarly, when the Buddhist says, apart from the body-mind, there is no separate entity called the self, the Advaitin says, yes, we are not saying that the Atma is something separate from the body and mind. In the body and mind, none of those constituents are the self, when the Buddhist says, anatma. The Vedantin, Advaitin can agree, yes, we are not saying that the body or the mind or the ego is the Atma. Rather, it is the reality, the existence consciousness in which the body and mind appear. That one is Atma. So anyway, that's an aside. What I want to say is, when the Buddhist denies a separate self and a self in the constituents of body and mind, it seems to deny the Hindu idea of Atma altogether. It does deny the dualistic conception of Atma, but not the Advaitic conception of Atma. All right.
Okay. Well, I'm going to pause right here because otherwise he might get into something a little bit longer. All right. So he did really clarify a lot about that last video about the nothingness, how everything is interdependent of each other, which I do agree with, actually. It's just for some reason I didn't quite understand that video, but he explained it quite well. I can't fault the other guy for that. I'm still just getting into Buddhism itself. and this is quite helpful, but we're only learning about the Four Noble Truths, and that first one has quite a lot of paths to it, which is kind of, I mean, I wonder if the other truths are like that too. I do remember something about the 8 pillars. Now, I don't know if that's something else completely different, or is that part of Buddhism. It's been a long while, and I've watched a lot of movies too. I may have been getting those things mixed up. Anyways, that's my reaction to the first part of the Four Noble Truths by Swami Sarvapriyananda. If you like my content, please consider subscribing. Thumbs up, thumbs down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next vid.